So labor law involves these things, of course. It prohibits unfair labor practices, but that's both by unions and by employers. It requires good faith collective bargaining, and it regulates, I guess for lack of a better word, the relationship between employers and unions. These are really pro-union cartoons that I've found to include in there. But so what are unions, right? Workers organizing collective voices to increase their ability to communicate with the employer. And now, 100 years ago, employers held all the chips. There's just no getting around that. And they could fire people for even speaking about creating a union, and they had just all kinds of power, right? And people needed jobs. Jobs were scarce. People needed money, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of this was to try to combat that and maybe equalize the power structure between employers and employees. We say they're inherently neither good nor bad, and the reason for that is it's difficult to find any good, solid evidence one way or the other that they do good things for the economy or that they do bad things for the economy, or that in today's day and age, that they provide a ton of benefits for employees versus in non-unionized places. So what we're seeing too is that the largest unions now, it used to be like the AFL-CIO, but now are representing mostly teachers and government employees. The biggest private one is the Service Employees International, SEIEU or something like that. Service Employees, yeah, okay. I guess I should work that or look that up. But it's become the biggest private, I believe, union. So labor management relationships, and it starts with collective bargaining. And one of the early laws, remember we talked about this in antitrust, we talked about the Clayton Act. And in the Clayton Act, remember there was exemptions for like baseball, for example, and some others that have come up. But it also, when the law was first passed, it exempted unions. So unions could form monopolies, basically, when it came to representing employees in employer-employment relationships. So the Railway Labor Act came along in 26, and it allowed collective bargaining for railroads and for airlines. I don't imagine there were a lot of airlines around in 26, but maybe. And set up a national mediation board, but just for that. Okay. In 32, one of the important laws was passed, and that was the Norris-LaGuardia Act, and that outlawed yellow dog contracts and prohibited some certain other court actions. But the yellow dog contracts is the main thing here. And what that was is employers still, at this point in time, were held more chips than the employees, and so they could legitimately, when they went to hire somebody, they'd put a contract in front of them that said, I will not attempt to form a union or join a union. Okay. And if you didn't sign the contract, you didn't get a job. It was kind of that simple. Well, the Norris-LaGuardia Act prohibited that, and so employers could no longer force prospective employees into doing that. Then along came the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. And that's important. That's probably on the test, that it's called both the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Act, because it did create the National Labor Relations Board, and it says dealt with business that's affecting commerce. Okay. Small employers are mostly covered under state laws. Okay. And it granted the NLRB quasi-judicial authority, and that's just like other agencies that we've talked about, right? They've got investigative authority, judicial authority, and legislative authority to a certain extent. So the National Labor Relations Board, it's an independent agency. Okay. It's 5 members. The president appoints those, I'm sure with the advice and consent of the Senate. They have jurisdiction over any business affecting commerce. They conduct the quasi-judicial hearings to investigate and enforce sanctions that may occur. There's a big case, and it was towards the end of the Obama administration, and I haven't really heard. It seems to have settled into the background now, but it had to do with with franchisors being responsible for perhaps their employee or the employee relationships amongst the franchisees. It's a big deal, and again, I haven't seen what the disposition of that is. I probably should look it up. It would make a very interesting point for the discussions. So personnel were exempt from the NLRB authority. Were those covered under the Railway Labor Act, because that was already in existence, and railroads have still have kind of a special place when it comes to laws. Employees who work for their spouse or their parents, household and domestic workers, and why I don't know, independent contractors certainly, government employees, yeah, because they get exempt from everything, and agricultural workers for whatever reason. So how do unions form? Well, they go through a certification process generally. It doesn't necessarily have to, but generally they do. If they don't, the employer can voluntarily recognize and bargain with the union. And why would you do that? Well, if you knew the vote was going to be overwhelming, you may just elect to do that as a sign of good faith, right? But otherwise it goes through a certification process, and first what happens is there has to be a petition. Okay, and the petition gets circulated, and if 30% of the employees who would be covered sign the petition, then the NLRB comes in and conducts an election. The election's on a secret ballot, okay, and the NLRB supervises that after the petition's been received. So, interestingly, if you follow the Montana University system, Bozeman about, 6 or 7 years ago actually did vote to certify and become a union. The faculty did become a union faculty. A few years later, they went through the opposite process, and they voted to decertify. Okay, and the process is the same in decertification, is that you get a 30%, you have a vote. The final vote there for both certification or decertification is a simple majority. Okay, that determines whether or not it's going to get covered. Certification through cards is something that was pushed, and what that was that if it was pushed, it was trying to make it federal law, which it has not become. But what that said is that if the employers, when they were doing the petition, if they came up with more than 51% of the people signing the petition, that would automatically force the employer then to recognize the union. And businesses fought that, and I can see why the business's standpoint would be, well, geez, what if the people supporting the union have a beer and pizza party, and under a lot of peer pressure and those types of things, they get people to sign that petition. Then the union might get formed without the business really having a proper opportunity to state their case. And so businesses have fought back, and thus far, the current law says, no, we're going to have an election. So you see, unions have been on a steady decline. They hit a height of, right at the very end of World War II, of 35.5%, and it's just kind of come down since then. And here, if we start here in the 70s, we kind of separated them. Percentage of all wage and salary workers is in the red, but the percentage of private sectors fallen down to about 6.6%. If you think about it, how many private sector employers do you know that would have a union workforce? UPS does. I imagine the railroad employees are still included in that, and then those service employees, they're a big one. So why has union membership been in decline? Businesses have opposed them aggressively. There's a Walmart documentary out about how aggressively they go after union organizers. Okay, so that's one reason. But new workers don't have the same kind of loyalty. Women and teens, unions were typically kind of blue collar, mining, manufacturing, those types of things in the Rust Belt here in the United States, and it was men jobs back in the day, and so that was kind of traditional union. As women and younger folks have entered the workforce, they don't seem to have the same interest in that. Okay? And ultimately they've been victims of their own success. And what do we mean by that? Well, a lot of the current laws that we have on our books that protect us in the workplace are laws that started as union by unions getting them enforced in their union contracts. Okay, and so they got enforced as a union contract. It turned out to be a pretty good deal and ultimately got passed into law. And so we all kind of enjoy those now. Just kind of the breakdown. I doubt that we would see anything in there. But government certainly and education are the two biggest areas. So let's pause here and we'll come back and talk about unfair labor practices.